One of the nice things about doing design for the web is that there are a lot of what are called open source resources for us to be able to use. Open source usually means free. And generally the web community is a little bit more generous with their code and with their applications than the proprietary side of our industry, which is print and Adobe, where you have to pay a lot of money. So one of those free services is an HTML validation service. So we have provided a link to that in the footer of our website, and we can actually use that to check and make sure that our code validates. There is a trick to it, though, one thing that you need to be aware of. This ties back to our discussion about locally hosted files versus publicly hosted files. So the local version of our template is what we've been building and previewing. We can tell that because there's the word file in the address, and if I follow the structure of the file, or the address path, I can see that these are actually folders on my computer. So no one else has access to these but me. And again, if you try to type this into your computer, you won't be able to get to it. Well, the validator can't get to it either. So if I click on my HTML validation button while I am viewing the local version of my file, I'm going to get an error. I can click on it, and it starts to open the website, and it works, except it says it cannot be checked. And the reason for that is this is a really cryptic message, but if you look at it closely, sorry, this type of URL scheme, meaning file, is not supported by this service. So all it's saying is it can't get to the file. Now, there are two things we could do about this. So if we want our link to work, we just need to put our page on our hosting space, and then when we click the public version of our page, it will work. But one other thing we could do, if we weren't quite done building yet and we just wanted to see how we were doing, is we could use this link on our local version of our file. You could still click it to open the validator. All it does is it gets us to the validator. And then if we click on these words, Markup Validation Service, you can see we have a new page here that allows us to either put in a web address, but we have two other ways we could do it. We could upload our file by choosing our template file, or we could validate by direct input. So I'm going to choose the direct input one, and I'm just going to copy all of my code into the direct input and click check. And what I'm looking for is a green light here, just a green bar that says there are no errors or warnings to show. Now let me very quickly put an error in my page so that you will be able to see what it looks like if that happens. I'm going to remove the language attribute from my HTML tag, and I'm going to replace the code that's in that direct input with an error. And let's see, let's add another one too. Let's take out the nav element closing tag, just one of my closing tags. And when I click check, I get some warnings, right? And the reason I wanted to do that is show you that these warnings can be really cryptic and you have to learn how to decipher them. But once you do, they can be really helpful too. So you can see here that one warning I'm getting says to consider adding a lang attribute to the HTML start tag to declare the language of the document. Now that's just a warning. It's saying it's not really an error, but that I should consider it. And it's giving me a few hints. So if I didn't understand what that meant, it's telling me line 1, column 16, which is a little harder, it's by character, to line 2. And it even highlights the HTML code. I get this context of a lang attribute, so as long as I know what an attribute is in HTML, I can kind of decipher what it's saying. And then if I was really confused, the way that I could interpret this would be, and what I would recommend you do, this is what I usually do with these as well if I don't know what they mean, copy the bold text, copy the warning message, paste that into a search engine, and you'll get the answer, I promise you. So here we've got Rocket Validator. I've never heard of them, so I might not start with them, but I have heard of Stack Overflow. This is a really great resource for both graphic designers and web designers and developers. And I can check with Stack Overflow to see what they say. And what I'm looking for here is an answer that has preferably a check mark next to it. These don't, no one gave the check mark. But in this case, I can see the tag here. I can see that it's saying give my HTML lang equals en. And so I can just add that language attribute back in. And then let's take a look at the other errors that we're seeing on the page. So you're going to see these a lot. And you notice here I've got 2 errors, and these 2 errors are actually to do with the same mistake. So what it's saying is that there was an in tag of footer seen, but there were open elements. So what that's saying is it saw where I closed the footer, but that I closed my footer with open elements still. And if you remember, I took this tag out in the validator. So it's saying it saw where I closed the footer, but that there were open elements still. Then we read further and it says there's an unclosed element nav. So that's a pretty big clue there. But if we weren't sure, again, we can see that it's around line 114 is where the footer is closed. And then we can see around line 80 is where it's saying that it saw something close. It's actually calling out the opening nav element around line 80. So if I piece those 2 together and I come to line 80 in my code here, I can see that at line 80, it's saying that this nav element is unclosed. It's also telling me that at line 114, the footer closed, but that there were other elements inside the footer that needed to be closed. So that gives me a pretty clear indication that that's my nav element. And if I have indented my code properly, I can even trace from where I opened my nav element down that same column, and I can see that it doesn't close. And so I could add my closing nav element back in. And even Sublime Text will hint that for me. All I typed was these first 2 characters, the less than symbol and the slash, and it closed the rest of the nav for me. It auto-completed that. So that also lets me know as validation that that's what was missing. And then I can revalidate my code. And I should get a green light now for fixing those errors. So this is a great way to find the bugs in your code and find the errors in your code. Now again, you can use direct input while you're working locally, but the way that I'm going to be grading your work and the easiest way for you to turn in your work and to check it as well is going to be for us to come back to FileZilla. And if you set up your site manager, you'll be able to use this link and find the site you want to connect to and just click connect. Otherwise, you have to use this quick bar every single time. And you can see here that I'm now looking at all of these files, and that for you, they should match. For me, I've got a couple of things on there that aren't. And you might also see this .well-known folder. Don't worry about it so much. When you see a dot in front of a file name and there's nothing else before the dot, that's a file for the computer. And if you're working on a Mac, it's more likely that the hosting computer is a PC. And so there's 2 different operating systems in order to communicate with each other. You might see some files that you wouldn't see if you were on a PC. And that file actually exists on the Mac too. Like this is what's happening here too with this .ds_store. This is not for us. When we see that dot, that just means it's for the computer and not for us. So we don't need to worry about it. You can ignore it. In some cases you can delete it, and if the computer needs it, it'll put it back. But really you don't need to worry about it. You can just ignore it. And in this case, what I need to do is just get my template file that I've been working on over to my website. And now it's on my hosting space. So the difference is going to be that now, instead of seeing file in my path, I need to navigate to the hosted version. So I need to come to my domain, which in my case is lhughes.cpccagd.com. And I can see template.html there. I can open it up. And now, since I'm at a hosted version of my site, something that's actually available on the internet for other people to see, my HTML validation button will also work. And now you see I get my green light. It's validating by URL. And so everything seems to be working pretty well. The last thing we might do before we wrap this assignment up is just check and make sure our CSS validation button is working. We don't have any CSS yet, but it should at least launch the validator. And what we're looking for is not only that it launches the validator, but that it's actually checking our template page directly instead of just checking the top of our domain. So if it only says your first initial last name.cpccagd.com and it doesn't say template, that might be an issue. And especially if it doesn't say your first initial and last name, but something else like www.cpccagd.com, that might signal that there's an error too that we need to fix. But as long as you see the full path of the page where you clicked the validator button, then you should be good to go. The only thing left to do really is to turn in the assignment. For each assignment, you do have some specific instructions to follow. Usually you're going to complete a written self-assessment. You want to make sure to do that in the text editor for the assignment for the learning management system. In our case, that's Brightspace. And you also want to make sure that you give me a link, not to the local version because I can't get to it, but that you give me a link to the public version of your template. So it begins with your first initial last name and it should have the cpccagd.com in the path bar. You want to give me a link to this, and you want to make sure that you write a complete sentence that describes what I'm going to find if I click on that link rather than just pasting this URL into the text editor. And what that is providing me with a call to action, which, as we've learned, is a complete sentence that tells the user what to do next, and it provides a link to the next page. So I should not see words like click here or link in that sentence, right? It should be a sentence that says something like, I have completed the template page for my website. And the words template page for my website would make great anchor text to hold the link to the template page for your website. So hopefully this is helpful for you. Let me know as you have questions. But this completes the assignment, and this allows you to do your first application of HTML. In the next assignments, we'll start learning how to change the way that this looks. So for now, you should only really concern yourself with how well you are using HTML to define the hierarchy of the page and to make sure that the page parts are accurately described to the browser.